in his footsteps.
They say that to truly know someone, you need to walk a mile in their shoes. But what does that really mean? It means understanding them, where they come from, what experiences they've had, and where they're heading, what they hope for, what they work for. It means discovering what is important to them and why. It means knowing their heart, what delights them, what fulfills them, and what pains them. This is truly knowing someone, and this is how we want to know Jesus. We can't walk a literal mile in his shoes, but we can retrace his footsteps in the Gospels. He has shared his story and his mission with us, and he has opened his heart to us. To truly love, serve, and be like Jesus, we need to know him, to really know him. This is what In His Footsteps is all about.
Welcome back to the apprenticeship. We are on a journey to love, serve, and be like Jesus.
We begin this journey with the book of Luke. Today, we focus on the foretelling of John the Baptist's birth. You can find it in Luke chapter 1, verses 5 to 25.
Sadly, we will not have time to read the entire passage together, so I encourage you to read it. You can use this week's study guide to deepen your understanding.
But we have a key verse, right, Douglas?
That's right, Rebecca. Our memory verse for this week is Luke chapter 1, verse 6. Our son, Christopher, will read for us.
Zachariah and Elizabeth were righteous in God's eyes, careful to obey all of the Lord's commandments and regulations.
Since we can't read the whole passage, I'll summarize the story. Zechariah was a priest. He was chosen by Lot to offer incense in the sanctuary. That's when the angel Gabriel appeared to tell him that he would have a son who would be the announcer of the Messiah. Zechariah was full of doubt, and as a result, he became mute for the pregnancy and birth of his son.
That was a very good summary, Rebecca.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
This story is very familiar, but we can still learn a lot from it.
For starters, we can look at the meaning of the names, Zachariah and Elizabeth. Zachariah means God remembers, and Elizabeth means my God has sworn, or my God is abundance. Their names signal to us that God remembers his promises. Even though it has been 400 years since a prophet spoke in Israel, God still remembers. And now, things are about to get real.
And there are clues in the story that point to that, aren't there? These clues link this event with these prophecies in the Old Testament.
That's true, Rebecca. The opening lines in verse 5 are written in a style like many of the Old Testament prophetic books, like Isaiah, Jeremiah, or Hosea. In verse 17, Gabriel quotes the last promise from the last prophet, Malachi, before the 400 years of silence between the Old and New Testaments. And even the presence of Gabriel is meaningful. The last time he appeared was to help Daniel understand God's vision about the future.
All these clues seem to be hinting at something.
That's right. They are highlighting that the stories in Luke didn't happen out of the blue. They are part of a larger divine plan. Luke is setting the story of Zachariah, Elizabeth, and John into the larger narrative of God's dealing with Israel and his plans for the whole world.
How exciting for Zechariah. He probably knew all these references. He would have known the promises and prophecies. And now, Gabriel tells him he's part of the plan.
Unfortunately, Zechariah does not seem excited, at least not at first. Look at verse 13. What does Gabriel have to say first?
Don't be afraid. It reminds me Of all the times when God had to say, "Don't be afraid," before he could say anything else.
That repetition really brings home that God is not someone to fear.
That's so true, Douglas. God is not someone to fear, but he's someone to believe. Which in verse 18, we see Zechariah does not at first. He reveals something unexpected in his heart. He asks, "How can I be sure this will happen?" This question is loaded with doubt, almost like he's asking for a sign, because the angel Gabriel coming from God's presence isn't enough of a sign. It's so surprising.
As a priest, he would have known the story of Abraham and Sarah giving birth to Isaac long after it was too late. If anyone could believe that God could do the impossible, it seems Zechariah would, but he does not.
Instead, he shows a kind of atheism. It's a hidden kind. It says, yes, there's a God, but it doesn't leave room for God to be a reality in the person's life. It's knowing, but not truly believing. Since he was a priest, we can safely assume that Zechariah knew much, yet he believed little.
But with God, we can know what we believe and believe what we know.
That reminds me of last week's memory verse in Luke chapter 1, verse 4. So you can be certain of the truth of everything you were taught. This week's memory verse in Luke chapter 1, verse 6. Before we see Zechariah's surprising lack of faith, we're told that God saw him and Elizabeth as righteous. The stage is set for us to think that Zechariah is a spiritual role model, which makes his lack of faith all the more shocking. But I don't think God was surprised by Zechariah's initial lack of faith.
Not a chance. So does this mean God still saw Zechariah in a positive light, even while knowing he would struggle to believe?
I think so. God is merciful and forgiving. He doesn't give up on his children. He sees what we are and what we can become. He continuously works in our lives for our good.
That is so encouraging. God sees what we are and what we can become. He wants to help us reach our potential. What are the ways God is working in our lives? And for what purpose? We will answer these questions right after this break.